Welcome, everyone, to another episode of People Solve Problems. I'm your host, Jamie Flinchball, and today we have as a special guest, David Kaganovsky. David, how you doing?
Having a great day so far.
Great. Well, we'll hopefully make it better, or at least not turn it the other way. Little introduction for David. He's the global head of product for brand at WPP. He's been a technology and product leader working at the intersection of brand strategy, product architecture, and applied AI. You've had senior leadership roles at Landor, Wavemaker, GroupM, PWC, and EY. So you've seen a lot of stuff. You've had your hands on at the front edge of a whole lot of things. And so excited to talk to you about your experiences. So let's get into some of those experiences and maybe talk about some things that were hard.
Yep.
Can you share, maybe a story around a really difficult problem that you had to work through from your past?
It's funny, Jamie, I was thinking about what has been an interesting problem to solve, right? And when I think about that, I first wanted to talk about actually a startup that I was part of. And you'll hear, tell me, maybe I'll weave in a couple of stories as I talk about this. The startup I went to was called Go. I went there, spent 2 years. It was an absolutely fantastic experience. And by the way, for anyone who's at any point in their career, I highly recommend going into a place. You walk in and there is no safety net. It's just you, a few other people, and a plan.
Fully agree with that.
And it's not going to work. And so in Go, what we needed to do is we needed to actually launch a platform that was going to change the way that you would get a car. It's actually a really interesting problem because the traditional way of getting a car is to go to a dealer. Well, even if you don't go to a dealership, if you just go on your favorite website, we were just, if you think about a Jeep Wrangler, you're going to go on that Jeep website and it is amazing. Millions of dollars were spent on having the most incredible experience. You can get excited about the car. You can learn all about it. You can go to the builder. You can build it. You can get the price. I mean, obviously it's the MSRP.
Right.
When you're finished, when you're ready to buy, what do you get? You get a little box right in the middle that says, what's your zip code? So that they can direct you to a dealership. And at that point, and with all, deference to anyone who listens to this, that's running a dealership or working with one, fact is buying a car hasn't changed since your grandpa bought a car.
Right.
We developed a concept that you could get a car by going to our website, with just a few clicks, find something that is new that we have. And with about 90 seconds worth of work, with just taking a picture of your driver's license back and forth, that produces for you an offer. And the offer is based on what's your driving record, what's your credit situation, not just credit score, credit situation. What is your insurance ability? What is the car that you want? Where do you live? Lots of different categories. And then you get that car, you place your deposit, and guess what happens? In a certain amount of time, that car shows up. It's in your driveway. You drive it. 3 years later, you give it back. Sort of feels like a lease, but acts actually much more like a true subscription online experience.
Yeah.
And so the problem that we went to solve is how do you do that? And it's the truth of the matter is that every single time that we would run into a wall, whenever we would try to solve that problem using the brain power behind the traditional way in which dealerships work, I think we failed. Whenever we try to address the problem, thinking about it as something else, thinking beyond, we're not talking about a car, we're talking about an experience, understanding sort of the underlying process that you're trying to enable, the underlying goal that someone's trying to achieve. Because if you're thinking, well, they're coming in here to try to get the best deal possible, the answer is no. Because we're not operating under that we're operating in a very different environment. In that case, when we succeeded is when we succeeded on focusing on those characteristics of the product that differentiated it from the traditional experience. So in other words, if we spend a lot of time, I think, on displaying the way a car would look on a traditional dealer website, I don't think that actually drove our customers to want to make the deal. what really drove them was the fact that they had a unique way to deliver the product. And when we succeeded is when we were actually able to deliver on that promise, deliver on a fast transaction, deliver on good delivery in terms of the vehicle actually showing up in that driveway, because it didn't always do that. Very good, in terms of service and being able to demonstrate access to information in terms of mileage and when you are due for a service checkup, those kinds of things. When we did it differently from the way the dealer does it, we succeeded. And I think that's what I sort of taught me a little bit about problem solving in general, which is don't solve the problem that is in front of you. I know it seems so obvious, but actually think about the problem behind the problem. The problem that you're trying to address is not about getting a car. The problem you're trying to address is, how do I make something that I find to be a common transaction sequence, which is I pick up my phone, I find the thing I want, and with just a few clicks, I actually can get it. I can get it if I'm ordering batteries, and I should be able to do the same thing when I'm getting a car. It's just a bigger transaction. When we focus on that, I think you succeeded.
Yeah, I love that story, and I like the problem behind the problem, right? What are you really after? What's really the intent? And as an interesting corollary, I think when most people talk about, say, problems with their, with their boss or their work or their team, it's oh, my boss did this to me or my team did that to me, and those are examples where what you're talking about isn't the real problem. There's something behind it that's
Right.
investigating. I'm kind of curious because you've done both big company and startup, and as I think we both agree, the lessons of going through that experience as a startup are very valuable. But there's always constraints in problem solving, right? And when you're in a big company, sometimes it's the policies and the current revenue stream and the org structure and who owns what. And in a startup, sometimes it's the lack of cash and the small team and lack of brand recognition and other factors. Um, are are the two sort of sets of constraints just different? Like every problem has constraints and they're different constraints, or are they wildly different problem solving experiences?
I'd like to, I actually, it's two answers. I'd like it to be different, but I don't think it is. And actually, I'll even draw you back to what we were talking about before. If we understand the motivation of the other party, the true motivation, what is actually, I find that human beings act rationally. Understand what is the motivations, what are the reward systems, the incentive system, the disincentive systems that they're operating under, and then everything else becomes easy. And those incentives and disincentives are different from big organizations to small organizations. There are, you hate to say this, but there's some people who are professional employees, and
Right.
you have to understand, what's their motivation in order to be able to get something from them. That's different. In a startup, you don't have that as much. There's no room to hide. There's no room to bury yourself. Everyone's quite exposed. But ultimately, if you can understand what is everybody's motivation, what's driving them towards that, I find that humans, we're all quite rational. We don't always understand what's behind that rationality.
Mhm.
We have to take the time to understand that. Whether it's studying your customer, studying your partners, studying your co-workers, understanding what are they really trying. Sometimes asking the question directly, sometimes not asking the question directly. Right? You have to discover what's the best way to get to that. But if you focus on getting to that underlying truth, underlying what is behind what they're trying to do, then I think that you've got a far better chance of succeeding. And that's where, whether it's, I said I maybe did I invent problem behind a problem? I think I did, but it sounds like a book and maybe I'll write one day. But 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 I think that if you can understand that, then you see with far more clarity what the other party really wants. What's the other party really going to do, and what do I need to do not only to deliver success to them, but in turn use that relationship, use that success for my own, right? For my own success. And so that's always what drives me, understanding that other problem, understanding what's the motivation, and applying. I suppose I'll add one more thing to it, which is applying a certain amount of positivity in the intent of the other party. In other words, things that seem negative And that we're humans. We accept things sometimes in a very negative way. But the truth is that if you can see the positivity, meaning what they're trying to get to is not to hurt you or to help you. It's actually to do something else. Then I think you've got a greater chance of finding that middle ground. And I will tell you, it just spurs a thought in my mind as I talk about it. Finding how you can both succeed is actually a skill and requires work. And the more we can do that, the more problems begin to solve themselves, right? Because you're now trying to apply not just how do I address what I need, but you're actually trying to address the counterparty. What is it that they need? And you can think about that: employees, customers, clients, coworkers, team members, whatever you're applying it to, you can actually apply that level of positivity to their intent. And as a result, I think you can get to the problem solution much faster.
Yeah. No, I think again that good intent is just misapplied. It could be they don't understand. It could be that you don't understand. There's a quote from one of the Batman movies. I can't remember which one, but some people just want to see the world burn. We've all probably met people like that, but that's not usually the case. And I always refer to I'm going to say, I forget if I have the name right, but it's Hanlon's razor, which is a logical exercise to say that never assign malice to which stupidity is a better explanation. Now, stupidity could be ignorance or just I haven't found the answer yet, right? But lots of versions. But the idea is I look at something and I assign malice to it, but it's usually not the most likely answer.
I think you're right. You're absolutely right about that. I'll tell you, one of my teammates, and I want to be very careful how I'm going to describe this because I don't want, God forbid, anyone actually hears this that they feel that they're called out. He does an excellent job of using AI to actually solve that problem. So what this individual does is collects a tremendous amount of content and context. And part of that is he set up an ecosystem. I'm going to call it that. There's technical stuff behind it, but let's just call it an ecosystem in which he can actually create personas. And he has created personas of the most important people. And what I've seen him use it very effectively is we've tested together. What does this person think of the idea? What does that person think of the idea? And so we try to bring that positive intent into that conversation as well. It's something we could all do, and actually interesting, technology allows us to do that kind of simulation today in a more effective way. Whereas in the past, how would I do it? You kind of put yourself in the other person's shoes, right? You think about it from their perspective. We actually have technology that allows me to do it in a far easier, more ubiquitous way.
Yeah. And again, even just from a persona standpoint, if you're talking about solving a customer problem, nothing beats talking to actual customers, but can I get through the first 20 questions to figure out even what questions to ask by using a digitally built digital twin of the customer persona to better understand their intent and how they would act based on a certain solution. So as some of the problems you're talking about, quite big, right? Quite complex and nuanced and lots of layers to them. And they all have different, components to building up to the eventual solutions that you need. How do you think about sort of breaking that down? How do you start with the big thing and break it down into pieces? Do you take it sequentially and just keep knocking down the next problem? And especially, again, from a technology build standpoint, architecture kind of implies I got to understand the end picture, but that's not always true. So how do you think about breaking it down?
There's two things. One, you don't always know what that end state looks like. And two, and this is becoming it more and more of a problem, technology, especially with this, just explosion of AI in our ecosystem, is making it so that the problem can be solved in a different way if you wait 6 months. If you wait a year, when I look back at the things I do today and, where we started, it's not the same. So I think that there's two things. One, you do have to break down the problem into consumable chunks, whatever it is that you want to do, consumable chunks, and focus very much on how, now I'm thinking about software. So this may not,
Yeah.
When you're building that product that I need to deliver, think about how do you deliver value as quickly as possible and how you consistently focus on the value creation throughout the evolution of that product. That is not the way that you would have approached certainly product or system development in the past when what proper waterfall systems or approaches were taken.
Right.
You know, you really have to define the end state. Why? Because nothing's going to change in the 18 months in terms of the technical landscape that you're operating in largely. And so we can define that future. There's a patience to deliver it. And that's why you've heard about 5-year implementations of software, 3-year implementations of software, the development over time. Today, we operate in a world where things that didn't exist 12 months ago are critical. You know, vibe coding, the phrase was invented or first came into our environment in February of 2025. It is now almost passe. Well, of course you're vibe coding because it has become so ubiquitous within the development community. So yeah, break down the problems, start thinking about them. Now, you do have to have a vision. By the way, in spite of all that, you still have to have a vision, but the vision has to be aspirational. It is as much about the direction of travel for the product as it is about rallying the troops, getting everyone to understand where are we going, how are we getting there, but accepting that change along the way isn't just inevitable, it's actually a positive sign. It's that you're keeping your ear to the ground, you're thinking about what's happening in the environment, and you're making that change, and never make an excuse for it. I'll give you an example. Oh, I tell you, I had one of the worst professional days of my life. It was only a few months ago. And it was, I'm being a little bit facetious, but we had made a promise to a client around the product that I'm building. Mm-hmm. And what became very obvious is that the promise that I made couldn't be kept. And I had really struggled with it. And in the last moments when I actually was on a call with the client about to sort of reveal that I don't think that we can accomplish what we want to accomplish, the solution became evident. And it became evident because what I realized was that we just have to paint the picture a little bit differently. Don't promise something into the deep, dark future that you don't actually understand. What you can do is you can look at what can we deliver right now and how can we bring value to that client in 2 months. And that's exactly what we did. We took a problem that I knew was going to be a challenge for the long term. And we said, let's think about value in the short term, deliver that value to them, and know that that will buy us the political, whatever the capital is, buy us the capital, the trust necessary to be able to then actually have the more difficult conversation around what we aren't going to be able to do or what we don't know how to do.
Yeah. Oh, and I when I jokingly refer to myself as a recovering engineer, I think that premise of there's sort of one right answer and one deterministic point in the equation, not really being the case, is an imperfect answer today, is a stepping stone towards that progression, and there's forks in the road and there's different pathways to get there, and not getting locked into that we change, our abilities change, the technology changes, and the problem can be re-understood, reshaped, revisioned as well.
I think if you apply that mindset, you actually give yourself the wiggle room necessary to adjust to the real world conditions. And I'm not an engineer, but I think that must happen in the real world all the time. You've got the architect. The architect has created that perfect vision. I'm thinking of a building. You know, the building that you have a rendering. You've got beautiful people. They're walking. They're enjoying the sunshine. There's parks. The whole thing. And then you hand that building to an engineer. And that engineer says, there's no way that you can construct the building this way because of legal reasons, structural reasons, material reasons, right? So you have to have the healthy tension between the vision and the realities of the ground and be able to trust each other enough to be able to actually negotiate your way through. Mm-hmm. Okay, how do we find the right balance that delivers the maximum amount of vision for in the real world?
Yeah. Love that analogy. So just a very little bit of time left, but you played in a lot of leadership roles, built teams, ran teams, delivered product through teams. So just from a leadership role, as you're doing this problem solving, how do you think about your role? When do you own it? When do you just kind of let people run with it? When do you kind of play coach or sponsor? how do you mitigate you being your best, but also your team being their best?
Yeah. Yeah. It's a challenging problem, and it actually is, it depends on your personality, I think is the right answer to all of those things. So I have two different ways of approaching. One, I like to give people as much freedom and rope as possible. And I do that for two reasons. The selfish reason is I don't know everything. So you find the best people to do the job, and then you got to give them the freedom to operate. Right. And but there's that other side of it, which is I never want to let go. I don't want to be in an environment in which I get a report in 3 weeks or in a month. It's not my personality. It probably is actually it could also be a bit of a limiting factor when it comes to certain types of things that I engage in. But I like to be in the mix. I want to be in the architectural decisions. I may not always understand every detail, but I'll ask enough questions to hopefully understand or relate them. And so I think that's the way to do it. And the reason I believe that works is because those people understand that they have my trust. And I genuinely would say that someone they begin with you have my trust, and then occasionally, it's actually not very often, someone will lose it. But at the same time, I believe that I'm showing them my investment by being present in those conversations. It's not meant to be oversight or subjecting them to a certain amount of micromanagement. It's actually quite the opposite. I want to be there so I can help you in those moments when you need it, and so that we can all take very corrective action. You can do it very quickly, and we can do it as a team. And so if you treat people that way, I think if you treat people with that level of respect for their skills, respect for the job that you've given them, and then, keep them accountable. Accountability in the best sense of the word, not in a negativity, but in the best sense of you're keeping me accountable, I'm keeping you accountable, and as a result, we're actually able to deliver something. And I don't think you can deliver on your own, right? So I would always start with that kind of a approach. And then yes, once in a while you get burned by it, which is okay. That's normal. And when you do that, you pick somebody up, and you make sure that you realize, even in the worst cases, when someone hasn't been able to deliver, that may not always be because they inherently are bad. Maybe just weren't right for the job at that time, and you want to make sure that you still respect them and respect what their contribution is, celebrate them, and move on, and kind of focus on what the rest of the team is doing.
Yeah. I love that term, investment in the work. And that's a hard thing to signal without actually being involved. And so I do see empowerment's good, but too many people interpret empowerment as abdication and detachment, and then what's the point of the leadership? I think that as a leader, you're invested in it is an important signal to send, and again, hard to fake that.
Jamie, I think that the world we're moving into for work, and this is speculative, but I feel pretty confident that, the AI new world, it's changing. I saw a picture recently. I wish I had authored it. I didn't, but it showed how we work right now as individuals and as teams, moving into a world where eventually we are going to be part of a team that manages a collection of AI driven and, developed agents, whatever you want to call it, right? But essentially this artificial intelligence that's going to do work for us. I think that puts us in a very different perspective. We have to be able to, all the things that made you a good manager, not a leader, I'm talking about a good manager, they actually are important again. And there was always a negativity. I always thought, well, with negative, leadership good, management's bad. But it's not bad, but it's actually quite important to be able to give people context. Right. That's what you do in AI. You know that, right?
Yep.
You give context, you give background, you involve yourself in the detail. You don't just take whatever comes out and just go, oh, there we go, this is the result. You actually are invested in the output of those AIs. And actually, so that same skill set, that all of that collection of skill set is going to be very valuable again in this new world.
Well, we'll all watch and participate in seeing how that future unfolds. And yes, David, thank you for coming on and sharing your perspectives, your experience, and your insight.
This has been a lot of fun. Thank you, Jamie.